Brazen crimes caught on camera show exactly why American cities are under siege. Check out what happened at a Walgreens in San Francisco. This is a man in broad daylight looting a store and just filling up a garbage bag. Then he just casually rides his bike out of the store and onto the street. Walgreens alone has closed 17 stores in the city just because of this rampant theft. And other companies are following suit. And there is some shocking video of a drive-by shooting in Atlanta's wealthy Buckhead neighborhood. People are running for their lives, but cops there aren't allowed to do anything about it. That's thanks to rules that limit police from chasing suspects. Residents in that neighborhood are fed up, and they want their own police force.
We are living in a war zone. That's how we describe living in Buckhead. And what has happened here in the last several years is an incredibly dangerous spike in crime and a complete vacuum of leadership. The police in Atlanta are great policemen and women. We love them. They just want to do their job, and they're not being allowed to do that.
Can anybody explain to me, maybe you can, Greg, why a politician would prohibit police from chasing suspects? Isn't that just telling suspects commit a crime and flee?
No, because what happens if you catch him? What happens if you catch him and that goes awry, and then you have the media there and you have a horde of people holding their phones and going like this? It's not worth it. Why did you think that the security guard in that video in Walgreens barely stuck his hand out to grab the bag? It's because for $20 an hour, it's not worth ruining his life the moment he becomes the suspect, the moment the media says, this poor man was just getting bread to feed his family. He filled the garbage bag with loaves of bread and milk, and then the security guard tackles him. So you can't, there's no interest in doing your job. This is part of the trickle-downing of, trickle-downing?
I like it. I'll allow it.
Of the vilification of police. So if the police aren't there, whoever takes their place will also be vilified, whether it is the private citizen or the security guard, anybody interested in that. We were talking about this a while ago. It's called the Brazilification, where the people who can afford it go back into their gated communities, hire private security. They're armed to the teeth because the state permits a lawlessness that no one else can survive. Lastly, I just want to make the point that, like, while we're talking about this, President Biden is approving this huge plan to tackle domestic terror. So this is happening. This is actually happening in America. But he's interested in this domestic terror. And I'm trying to figure out, like, I know the names of MS-13. I know Al-Qaeda. I know ISIS. Who are these giant gangs that he's talking about that's doing this crime? Like, why aren't we asking that question? Someone's got to talk to Jill.
Dr. Jill Biden, he's referring to. I was doing a shoot today downtown in Union Square, Dana, and we walked past the situation. We saw a homeless man stab an off-duty police officer in the neck with a pair of scissors. Jesus. This is broad daylight. I didn't see it, but we came in right afterwards. The ambulance was right there. This has never happened before. I've been shooting in Union Square for about a decade. That has never happened, anything like that in this city, in that neighborhood. And then people just witness it and go about their day.
Well, and also there's a big fight at Washington Square Park, which is not too far, I guess, from there, and which I've read some things that were happening there that I could not even believe were printed in the newspaper. And now they're blaming the neighbors for complaining.
Yeah.
How dare you complain that there's this happening? The other thing that's happening is guess who is now the villain in San Francisco?
Who?
Walgreens.
Right.
No.
Because they've closed stores. So I was just looking at this Michael Schellenberger Twitter feed, and he was responding to a guy who said, well, Walgreens really is at fault. Like, why are they at fault? Well, they lie. And they're closing stores because they want to make more money, and they're closing stores because they're actually. I'm like, we're watching this happen right there. And why does he think that'll happen? The other thing is, from a bigger perspective, all across America, there's been this push, and we've talked about them a little bit, from mega donors on the left that have pushed for very progressive district attorneys.
Yeah.
And what happens then? So you have a different way of punishment for crimes. Now, it could be on the one in Atlanta. One of the things that that city councils have decided is that don't have the police chase a suspect, because if you then end up injuring an innocent person in the chase, that ends up causing even more problems, and that you can try to catch the criminal later. That's the thinking. I'm not necessarily
catch the criminal later.
But
that's a good strategy. We have a Dwayne Reed near my place in the city.
Great guy.
And Mr. Reed.
Yeah.
Yes, and I call this guy the White Claw Bandit, because he will just come into the store, load up with a case of White Claw, and just run out of the store. And no one can do anything about it. You're not allowed to stop him. You can't even trip him. You can't even stick your foot out and trip him. And
if he injures his neck, he'll sue you.
Right. You just have to call the police, and they write that off as just, you know, case of White Claw. That's the cost of doing business.
Go to Ducey's office and ask for it.
Who is stealing
Ducey
White Claw?
loves his White
I don't
Claw.
know why you would steal a box.
But I usually never see this, but I see it more and more.
It's interesting because there's this, I think it's the insidiousness of Marxism. I really do. I think it's this idea of redistribution that has taken hold. And so people hear that on loop, and they hear that sort of reinforced all day long. And it's not just progressives anymore. They're mainstream Democrats that are talking about different ways of redistributing, and, you know, the Patriot tax, and we're going to take your wealth and we're going to give it out justly. So people are like, oh, that's great. These corporations are rich. I'm going to take their stuff and then I'm going to sell it and make money. And that means that the system is sort of upside down. It's one of the reasons that I despise Marxism, because it hates the idea of private property, and it feels that theft is justified. Cynthia Nixon, who was the least likable character on Sex and the City, she ran for...
What about Steve? Sorry.
I think people like...
I thought it was Mr. Biggs was the least likely.
No, everyone loved Big, but Steve was okay because Miranda just sort of beat him.
Miranda, I love you.
Yeah, beat him into the ground. That's it, exactly.
That's too good.
But she was like, you know, stop arresting people for shoplifting. Poor people need stuff. And then all these poor people just attacked her on Twitter. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I don't make a lot of money, and I don't steal stuff. Back off, lady, because there's no more uniform distribution of standards.
And it affects me, Richard, because now I go to Dwayne Reed, and everything is locked up behind the case.
Yeah,
I want floss for $2.99. I have to push a button. I have to wait for the woman to come over and unlock it, see I'm getting floss or something else that I don't want anybody else to see, and everything's locked down.
Don't you, Cream?
Well, no, I think the fact that stores locked on all these products is very terrible. I think it happens far too much. You know, I think...
Thank you for taking that strong stand, Richard.
Yes, I will take that strong stand with you, Jesse. Amen. But with that being said, I do think, you know, we do have a spike in crime, and I think we need to have a larger conversation about how we actually work with community to solve that problem. It can't just be the cops doing it by themselves. It's like, what? Because here's the problem. The problem is this policy that we have, right, of whether you call it anti-police policy or whatever, was created because there was people who had problems with how the cops are doing business. So maybe it's a bringing in community, bringing in lawmakers, or bringing in police and saying, how do we find some middle ground? There's calls that we shouldn't be at. Cops will tell you, we don't want to be at domestic violence calls. We don't want to be at drug abuse calls, because that's not what we're trained to do.
Actually,
so let's
domestic violence calls can be some of the most dangerous calls.
I agree with you, but there are
to.
people that are trained to deal with domestic violence that don't.
Not social workers. You don't want to send them there.
But there are grief counselors, the people that do this work all day.
But if there's a drive-by shooting in Buckhead, do you send a grief counselor?
No, I think when there's a drive-by shooting, you send police. And to Dana's point,
but they can't chase.
But the reason why police don't chase, for obvious reasons, is because oftentimes community members get caught in the crosshairs and they end up being the victims.
No, that's not.
That was the case of Breonna Taylor. She died because she was not a victim. She was just a victim.
That's not an
she was sleeping in her bed,
case.
and she was killed because they were looking for somebody else, and they had a no-knock warrant to the wrong address.
I understand that, but that's not often. If someone steals something or shoots somebody in the street, police have to pursue to apprehend that person. Or else, what are they just going to wait around until this guy shows his face on a surveillance camera?
But in how many high-speed chases do
work.
innocent citizens get hurt?
I would disagree with the fact that it's a large percentage.
But you know, the idea of community police working together, you have a lot of minority majority forces in which now the black captains and the black leaders have to resign. So there was progress that was being made, but there's a specific activist mentality that is not interested in what you're talking about, right?
So I disagree with that. I think if you look at the case of Breonna Taylor, you look what her family did in their settlement. What they did in their settlement is they actually pushed the Louisville Police Department to make some necessary changes. One of those changes is if you are a police officer that serves on the Louisville Police Department, they ask you to live where you work. An easy thing to fix the problem.
Can't do that in New York.
Okay, but what about Val Demings
Right,
and
good
Carmen
luck.
Best?
All right.
Val Demings, they were talking about having her as Joe Biden's number 2, and activists were like, no, she's blue. She's no longer black. And Carmen Best, who is the chief of police in Seattle, was forced out of her job because they were going to cut her pay.
Listen, I actually like Val Demings, and I think
right.
when you listen to what Val Demings did, is she went into community and had conversation with the residents that lived there to fix the problem.
All right, Val Demings, we got it.
She's going to beat Marco Rubio as well. But,
We'll see.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.